I grew up in a house where money was always a careful calculation, never an assumption. My father worked in facilities management at a mid-sized manufacturing plant, the kind of place that made industrial components nobody thought about, but that kept other businesses running. He'd been there for 15 years by the time I was in high school, moving up from general maintenance to supervising a team of technicians, but his salary had plateaued somewhere that kept us comfortable without ever being secure. My mother did bookkeeping for a dental practice 3 days a week, managing accounts receivable and insurance claims in a small office that smelled perpetually of antiseptic and the particular anxiety of people waiting for procedures they'd been putting off. Together they brought home maybe $70,000 a year in a region where that meant you weren't struggling, but you also weren't comfortable, where you could handle planned expenses but lived in constant awareness that unplanned ones could cascade into real problems. We existed in that particular American middle space where you're comfortable enough not to qualify for help, but anxious enough to feel every unexpected expense like a small wound. Our house was a 3-bedroom ranch built in the 70s, clean but small, with carpet that had been there when we moved in, and appliances that my father maintained meticulously because replacing them wasn't really an option. We had one bathroom that we all shared, and on school mornings there was an unspoken choreography to avoid conflicts over shower time and mirror access. The water heater was old enough that if someone ran a load of laundry while someone else was showering, you'd hear shouting about the temperature dropping. These were small indignities that probably marked us as lower middle class to anyone paying attention, though mostly people weren't paying attention because we were good at being unremarkable. Our car was a Honda Civic that my father had bought used when I was 8 and had kept running through a combination of regular maintenance and minor repairs he'd do himself in our driveway on weekend afternoons. He'd taught me to change oil, replace air filters, check tire pressure, all the basic maintenance that could save you money if you knew how to do it yourself. I remember being maybe 10 years old, lying on the driveway concrete looking up at the undercarriage, while he pointed out different components and explained their functions, and feeling like this was important knowledge, even though none of my friends' fathers seemed to do this kind of work themselves. Our vacations were modest drives to state parks rather than flights to destinations. Once or twice a summer we'd load the Civic with camping gear and coolers full of food and drive to places within a few hours, parks with hiking trails and lakes where swimming was free. My parents would pack sandwiches instead of buying food at restaurants, and we'd spend long days outside because it didn't cost anything to walk through woods or sit by water. I actually liked these trips, the simplicity of them, the way my parents seemed more relaxed when they weren't worrying about money. But I also understood that other families took different kinds of vacations, flew to Florida or California or even abroad, stayed in hotels with pools, ate at restaurants without checking prices first. I learned early that wanting something didn't mean you'd get it, that plans required backup plans, and that the gap between where we were and where other people started wasn't something you talked about. It was just something you lived with. When I was in 6th grade, I wanted to join a travel soccer team that some of my classmates were on, and my parents sat me down and explained very gently that the registration fees and equipment costs and travel expenses would be difficult for us to manage, and maybe I could do the recreational league instead, which was less competitive but also less expensive. I said okay and never brought it up again, and I think they appreciated that I didn't push or complain, but I also think they felt guilty about it in a way that made me feel guilty for wanting it in the first place. That pattern repeated in different forms throughout my childhood. When other kids got new gaming systems, I'd wait until they'd been out long enough to find used versions at reasonable prices. When friends talked about summer camps or music lessons or other enrichment activities, I learned to redirect conversations or quietly not participate. I got good at assessing what was accessible to me and what wasn't, developing an internal calculation system that automatically filtered desires through feasibility. It wasn't traumatic exactly, but it was formative, teaching me that resources were finite and that navigating scarcity required planning and self-discipline and a certain emotional detachment from wants that couldn't be met. I was a quiet kid by nature, the type who found it easier to observe than participate, though I'm not sure if that was innate temperament or learned adaptation. In elementary school, I was the one who finished worksheets early and then sat there not quite knowing what to do with the extra time. Teachers would sometimes suggest I help other students who were struggling, positioning me as a peer tutor, but that felt awkward and performative, like I was being asked to perform helpfulness for the benefit of adult observers. I'd usually just sit there and doodle in the margins of my finished work, or reread whatever book I'd brought from home, waiting for the class to catch up. In middle school, I joined the chess club, not because I loved chess, but because it gave me somewhere to be that felt purposeful. The club met Wednesdays after school in Mr. Davenport's classroom, a dozen or so kids who were mostly like me, academically capable but socially peripheral. We'd play quiet games and sometimes talk about strategy or famous matches, and it was comfortable in the way activities are when everyone's there, because they don't quite fit elsewhere. I was decent at chess, good enough to win about half my games against club members, not good enough to compete seriously. What I liked was the clarity of it, how every piece had defined capabilities and movement patterns, how you could study positions and identify better and worse moves based on logical analysis rather than social intuition. I read constantly, mostly science fiction and fantasy novels from the library, and I developed elaborate systems for maximizing my reading time. I'd check out the maximum allowed number of books every 2 weeks, plan my reading order based on length and anticipated difficulty, and track my progress in a notebook to make sure I finished everything before renewal deadlines. My parents encouraged my reading, but they also gently pushed me toward practical things too, concerned that I was spending too much time in imaginary worlds and not enough time developing skills that would matter for real life. Looking back, I think I liked those stories because they suggested that being overlooked might actually be an advantage, that the quiet ones sometimes turned out to matter most. The protagonists were usually ordinary people who discovered hidden potential or secret destinies. Farm boys who turned out to be princes, orphans who turned out to be wizards, overlooked children who turned out to hold the key to saving everyone. There was wish fulfillment in that, obviously, but also a kind of moral logic that appealed to me. The idea that the current social order wasn't the final truth, that patient observation and careful development could reveal capabilities that more obviously gifted people had missed. My father understood this better than my mother did, I think, though neither of them discouraged it directly. He'd sometimes bring home broken electronics from work, things that were being thrown out anyway, and we'd take them apart together at our kitchen table on Sunday afternoons. He'd show me how circuits connected, how systems were designed to be efficient, how understanding the internal logic of something gave you power over it that casual users never developed. We'd identify what was broken, sometimes fix it, sometimes just catalog the components and understand how they'd been intended to work together. He never said it explicitly, but I think he was teaching me that systems that looked complicated from the outside were usually comprehensible if you took the time to understand their structure. My mother took a different approach, more focused on practical financial literacy. She'd bring home extra bookkeeping ledgers from the dental office and show me how to track expenses, how compound interest worked, how small decisions accumulated into large outcomes over time. She'd set up mock budgets and have me allocate resources across different categories, making trade-offs between wants and needs, learning to forecast future expenses and plan for them. At the time, it felt a little tedious compared to taking apart electronics with my dad, but it built habits that would matter later. The discipline of tracking everything, the patience of waiting for compound effects, the recognition that small efficiencies compounded just like debts did. Between my father teaching me systems thinking and my mother teaching me financial discipline, I developed a particular way of moving through the world that was simultaneously analytical and cautious. I learned to look for underlying patterns, to assume that surface appearances were usually incomplete, and to trust that patient observation would reveal leverage points that hasty action would miss. This served me well academically, but made me somewhat odd socially, the kind of kid who might suddenly observe something precise and true about group dynamics, but who couldn't quite figure out how to be comfortable within those dynamics. By the time I reached high school, I developed the particular self-awareness of someone who knows exactly where they stand in the social order. I wasn't bullied, I wasn't invisible, I was just comfortably irrelevant. I had a small circle of friends, other quiet kids who were into computers or debate or academic teams, and we existed in our own bubble that rarely intersected with the main currents of school social life. We ate lunch in the same corner of the cafeteria, we partnered on group projects, we made plans to see movies on weekends that we'd sometimes cancel at the last minute because none of us really wanted to be the one to commit first. It was a safe, low-stakes existence. I got good grades without really trying, stayed out of trouble by default, and assumed this pattern would continue indefinitely. The school itself was typical for our area, a regional high school that pulled from several towns and served maybe 1,800 students across 4 grades. It had been built in the 70s and renovated in the late 90s, so it had that strange combination of dated architecture and aggressively cheerful new paint that made everything feel slightly off. The hallways were wide and institutional, lined with lockers that clanged constantly between periods, and the classrooms had that particular smell of dry erase markers and floor cleaner that I still associate with teenage anxiety. The student body sorted itself in predictable ways. There were the athletes, the theater kids, the AP students, the stoners who hung out in the parking lot, the church youth group crowd, the kids who were already working nearly full-time at their parents' businesses, and then there were the wealthy kids, the ones whose families had real money, not just comfort but actual wealth, and they moved through the school with a kind of casual confidence that seemed almost innate. That's where Vanessa Prescott existed, at the absolute center of that top tier. Her father owned Prescott Construction Holdings, which wasn't just a local business, but a regional operation with projects across 3 states. They built commercial developments, public infrastructure, the kind of large-scale work that required relationships with politicians and bankers and other people who made decisions that affected thousands of lives. The Prescotts lived in a house I'd only seen from the road, one of those estates on the edge of town where the properties measured in acres rather than lots, where you couldn't see the house from the street because the driveway was too long. Vanessa drove a car that was newer and nicer than anything my parents had ever owned, wore clothes that looked casual but probably cost more than our monthly grocery budget, and had that particular kind of beauty that came from good genes maintained by good orthodontics and dermatology and whatever else people with money did to ensure their children looked like the best possible versions of themselves. But it wasn't just the money that made her central. Some wealthy kids were awkward or shy or trying too hard. Vanessa was genuinely magnetic. She was smart without being nerdy, involved without being overbearing, pretty without seeming to think about it too much. She played on the volleyball team, organized charity events, got lead roles in school musicals, and maintained a GPA that suggested she could go anywhere she wanted for college. She had a group of close friends, other girls from similar backgrounds, and together they formed this nucleus that seemed to generate the school's social weather. When they liked something, it became popular. When they moved on from something, it died. They weren't mean exactly, or at least not in obvious ways. They were just powerful in that subtle, unquestioned way that comes from never having had to think about whether you matter. I first really noticed her in sophomore year, though of course I'd been vaguely aware of her existence before that. We had AP World History together, and I sat 2 rows behind her and 1 seat over, which meant I spent most of the class period looking at the back of her head. She had this habit of pulling her hair over one shoulder when she was concentrating, and she took notes in this very neat, organized way that suggested she actually cared about understanding the material rather than just memorizing enough to pass. Sometimes, when the teacher said something interesting, she'd make this small sound, almost like a quiet laugh, and it was so specific and unguarded that it felt like seeing something private. I started paying attention to when she'd do it, what kinds of ideas triggered that response, and I built up this weird mental catalog of what made her intellectually curious. I know how this sounds. I know it's the kind of thing that looks obsessive from the outside, the quiet kid fixating on the popular girl he has no chance with. But at the time, it didn't feel pathological, it felt like pattern. Recognition, like the same kind of attention I paid to chess positions or programming logic. I wasn't fantasizing about grand romantic gestures or imagining she'd somehow notice me and everything would change. I was just genuinely fascinated by her as a person, by the gap between her public performance and these tiny moments of authentic reaction. Most people at school seemed to see her as this fixed thing, this beautiful, confident, wealthy girl who existed at the center of everything. But in class, I could see her actually thinking, actually engaging with ideas, and it made her feel more real and more interesting than the version everyone else seemed to worship. Things shifted during a group project in the spring of that year. The teacher assigned us to 4-person teams to research different aspects of the Industrial Revolution and present our findings. Through sheer random luck, I ended up in a group with Vanessa and 2 of her friends, Caroline Whitfield and Natalie Sterling. I assumed I'd end up doing most of the actual work while they contributed minimal effort and took equal credit, which was the standard pattern for projects that mixed the academic-focused kids with the social elite. But Vanessa surprised me. At our first meeting in the library, she actually showed up with notes already prepared, questions about how we should divide the research, ideas about making the presentation engaging. Caroline and Natalie were less invested, checking their phones and making plans for the weekend, but Vanessa kept pulling the conversation back to the project. I found myself actually talking in front of her, sharing ideas about how we could connect the economic patterns to modern globalization, and she listened in this focused way that made me feel like what I was saying mattered. When I suggested we create a visual timeline showing the relationship between technological innovation and labor conditions, she immediately got excited about it and started sketching out how it could work. For that hour in the library, we were just 2 people interested in the same intellectual problem, and the usual social hierarchy felt temporarily suspended. Caroline made some joke about us being the nerds of the group, but Vanessa ignored her and kept working. Over the next 2 weeks, we ended up doing most of the project together. We'd meet in the library after school, sometimes joined by Caroline and Natalie for token appearances, and we'd work through the research and build the presentation. Vanessa was legitimately smart and engaged, and our conversations moved beyond just the assignment. We talked about other classes, about teachers we liked and didn't like, about books we'd read and ideas we found interesting. She mentioned she was thinking about studying economics or business in college, following in her father's footsteps, but in a more analytical way, and I found myself telling her about how my dad taught me to understand systems, how I liked figuring out how things worked at a fundamental level. There was this one evening when we stayed late and the library was nearly empty. We'd finished the main work and were just polishing the presentation, and the conversation drifted into more personal territory. She asked me what my parents did, and I told her honestly, and instead of the subtle condescension I'd learned to expect, she just nodded and asked follow-up questions that seemed genuinely curious. She talked about the pressure she felt to live up to her family's expectations how sometimes it felt like her whole identity was already mapped out before she got to choose anything. It was the most real conversation I'd ever had with someone from her world, and it made me think that maybe the social divisions I'd accepted as permanent were more fragile than they seemed. The presentation went well. We got an A, and afterward Vanessa thanked me specifically for my contributions in front of the class, which felt significant. For a few days I thought something had shifted. She'd smile when she saw me in the hallway, sometimes stop to make a quick comment about the class, or ask about an assignment. It was nothing dramatic, but it was contact, acknowledgement, and to someone who'd spent years being comfortably invisible, it felt like being seen for the first time. That's when I made my first mistake. I let myself believe it meant something. I let myself think that the connection we'd had during the project was the beginning of something rather than just a temporary circumstance. I started paying even more attention to her, looking for opportunities to talk, engineering reasons to be in the same spaces. I'd show up to after-school events I normally wouldn't attend because I knew she'd be there. I'd take slightly longer routes between classes just to pass by her locker, and I convinced myself this was normal, that this was how attraction worked, that if I just created enough opportunities for interaction, eventually, she'd see me the way I'd started seeing her. The rational part of my brain knew this was delusional. I understood the social mathematics. We existed in different worlds, and a single group project didn't dissolve those boundaries. But there's something about being 16 that makes you believe in exception cases, in the idea that individuals can transcend systems through sheer force of feeling. I'd spent my whole life being realistic and careful, and for once I wanted to believe that wanting something badly enough could actually matter. By the start of junior year, I'd constructed this elaborate fantasy relationship in my head. I knew what music she listened to based on overheard conversations, what colleges she was considering, what her schedule was, which friends she was closest to. I'd mentally cataloged her preferences and opinions to the point where I could predict her reactions to things we hadn't even discussed, and the dangerous part was that occasionally she'd still acknowledge me, still smile or make a brief comment, and I'd interpret those tiny interactions as evidence that my attention wasn't completely unwelcome. The rational move would have been to talk to my friends about this, to get some external perspective that might have broken the spell. But I didn't, because I knew exactly what they'd say. They'd tell me I was setting myself up for disappointment, that people like Vanessa Prescott didn't end up with people like me, that I should focus on girls who were actually in my social orbit, and I didn't want to hear that, because hearing it would force me to confront reality, and I wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. Instead, I did something monumentally stupid. I wrote her a letter. This was before social media was quite as dominant as it is now, when texting was still relatively new, and email felt too casual for important things. A physical letter felt serious and thoughtful, something you did when you wanted to communicate real feeling rather than just throw words into the digital void. I worked on it for weeks, revising and refining, trying to capture exactly what I wanted to say. I tried to be honest without being pathetic, romantic without being creepy, genuine without being melodramatic. I talked about how I'd noticed her in class, how our conversations during the project had meant something to me, how I admired not just how she looked, but how she thought. I told her I understood we came from different backgrounds, but that I thought real connection was about more than social circumstances. I said I'd like to get to know her better, to see if what I felt might be reciprocated, and that I'd understand if she didn't feel the same way, but I had to at least try. Reading it now in my memory, it's painful how earnest it was, how nakedly vulnerable, how completely it revealed the power imbalance I was trying to pretend didn't exist. But at the time, it felt brave and right, like I was finally being honest about something that mattered instead of just passively accepting how things were. I put it in her locker on a Tuesday morning before school. I'd watched enough to know her schedule, to know when she'd arrive and when she'd check her locker, and I timed it so I could slip the envelope in without being seen. Then I spent the entire day in a state of suspended anxiety, unable to focus on anything else, running through every possible outcome in my head. The best case was that she'd be touched and intrigued and we'd talk and something would begin. The worst case was that she'd gently let me down and things would be awkward for a while, but eventually return to normal. I genuinely didn't consider what actually happened. I didn't see her that day, which I took as neutral, rather than ominous. But that evening, Caroline Whitfield posted something on social media, a photo of the letter, my handwriting, my signature, with a caption that said something like, "When someone thinks they have a chance, just because you were nice to them once." It had already been liked and shared by dozens of people from our school. The comments were a mix of mockery and secondhand embarrassment and performative sympathy, but the underlying message was clear. I'd massively overstepped, and this was what happened to people who didn't understand their place. I felt my entire body go cold as I scrolled through the reactions. People I barely knew were weighing in on my feelings, on my worth, on how delusional I must be to think someone like Vanessa would ever be interested in someone like me. The letter that had felt brave and vulnerable now felt pathetic and presumptuous. Every sentence I'd carefully crafted, now evidence of how disconnected I was from reality. And the worst part was that Vanessa hadn't just rejected me privately, she'd shared it with someone who made it public, which meant she thought my feelings were something worth mocking, rather than something deserving basic discretion. I didn't go to school the next day. I told my parents I was sick, which wasn't quite a lie because I genuinely felt physically ill, nauseous and shaky, and unable to imagine walking into that building and facing everyone who'd seen the post. The physical symptoms were real enough that my mother believed me without much questioning. She brought me tea and crackers, checked my temperature, suggested I stay home and rest. I lay in bed with my phone turned off, unable to look at social media, but also unable to stop imagining what was being said there, what narratives were forming, how the story was probably mutating beyond anything I could control or correct. My mother checked on me multiple times throughout that day, concerned because I was usually so healthy, so reliable, so low maintenance. She'd put her hand on my forehead checking for fever, ask if I needed anything, offer to call the doctor if I was feeling worse. And each time I had to perform being sick from something physical rather than sick from humiliation and social death, and the gap between what I could explain and what was actually wrong felt enormous and unbridgeable. I considered telling her the truth, just laying out what had happened and asking for help, or at least comfort, but I couldn't imagine how that conversation would go. What would she do? Call the school? That would make everything worse. Confront the Prescotts? We had no leverage there. Tell me it would be okay? We both would have known that was a lie. So I just lay there and stared at the ceiling and felt the full weight of my miscalculations settling into my bones, becoming part of my basic understanding of how the world worked and where I fit in it. I kept running through alternative scenarios, paths I could have taken that would have avoided this outcome. I could have never written the letter. I could have written it differently, more casual and less intense. I could have given it to her privately instead of putting it in her locker where anyone might see it. Each alternative felt obvious in retrospect and impossible to access from the position I'd been in when I'd actually made the choice. But I couldn't avoid school forever. Wednesday, I tried to tell my mother I was still sick, but she looked at me with this expression that suggested she knew something else was going on. And she said gently that whatever was wrong, hiding from it wouldn't make it better. She didn't push for details, but she made it clear that staying home again would require more explanation than I was prepared to give. So Thursday I forced myself to go back, arriving late to minimize hallway exposure, entering through a side door that was usually less crowded, moving quickly to my first period classroom, and slipping in just as the bell rang. Immediately I understood that the story had grown beyond the initial post. During the 2 days I'd been gone, people had apparently talked about nothing else, adding details that weren't true but were too entertaining to fact-check, constructing a narrative that had evolved beyond anything I could recognize. I heard whispers as I walked to my desk, saw people leaning together and glancing at me, felt the particular kind of attention that comes from being the subject of gossip rather than a participant in it. The teacher started class and people mostly focused forward, but I could feel the awareness underneath everything, the knowledge that I was being observed and evaluated and discussed. Between first and second period, I experienced the hallway gauntlet for the first time. Groups of students would spot me and react, sometimes just staring, sometimes whispering to whoever they were with, sometimes making comments that were loud enough for me to hear, but indirect enough that I couldn't really respond to them without looking paranoid or confrontational. Someone said something about guys who don't know when to give up. Someone else made a joke about checking if he had a crush on them. Better be careful. A girl I'd never spoken to looked at me with this expression of pity mixed with disgust, like I was simultaneously pathetic and vaguely threatening. The worst were the people who tried to be kind, but just made everything more humiliating. A girl from my English class, Melanie somebody, came up to me and said in this very gentle voice that she was sorry about what happened, that Caroline shouldn't have posted that Vanessa should have handled it more privately. Her intentions were good, but the effect was to confirm that yes, this was as bad as I thought, that people were talking about it enough that even tangentially connected acquaintances felt compelled to offer sympathy. I mumbled something that might have been thanks and escaped as quickly as possible. By third period, I'd heard several different versions of what had happened. Someone said I'd been stalking Vanessa for months, following her around and showing up places she went. Someone else said I'd written her multiple letters, each one more intense than the last. Someone claimed I'd threatened to hurt myself if she didn't go out with me, that the letter Caroline posted was actually the least concerning one. Someone said I'd tried to friend request her mother on Facebook as part of some weird strategy to get close to the family. None of these things were true, but each iteration made me more pathetic and creepy, and there was no way to correct any of it without making things worse by drawing more attention to myself and making me seem defensive or unstable. Lunch was its own special hell. My usual friend group was at our normal table in the corner of the cafeteria, but when I approached with my tray, they all got very quiet in this way that made it obvious they'd been talking about me. I sat down and nobody said anything for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. Finally, Cameron, who I'd known since freshman year and had always been pretty straightforward, said, "Hey man, tough week, huh?" in this tone that was trying to be sympathetic but also slightly uncomfortable, like he wasn't quite sure how to navigate this situation. I said, "Yeah," trying to keep my voice neutral and move the conversation past it. But someone else, I think it was Oliver, said they'd seen the post and thought it was pretty messed up that Caroline shared it publicly like that, which would have been supportive, except then he added that, still, I probably shouldn't have written something so personal to someone I didn't really know that well. And that framing, the suggestion that I'd made a mistake in being too vulnerable with someone who wasn't really a friend, cut deeper than the outright mockery had because it came from someone who was supposedly on my side. The conversation limped along for a few more minutes before people started finding excuses to leave. Someone remembered they needed to talk to a teacher. Someone else had homework to finish. Within 10 minutes, I was sitting alone at the table, and when I looked around the cafeteria, I could see people at other tables, glancing over and then quickly looking away when I made eye contact. The isolation was so complete and so visible that even trying to maintain normal routines highlighted how abnormal everything had become. That afternoon during study hall, I saw Vanessa for the first time since the letter went public. She was at the center of a sympathetic crowd near the library entrance, surrounded by friends who were clearly offering comfort and support. I was too far away to hear what they were saying, but I could see the body language, the way they were oriented around her protectively, the way she was accepting their comfort with this perfect balance of discomfort and composure. She was playing the role of the gracious victim who didn't want to make a big deal out of an awkward situation, but was also kind of disturbed by the intensity of my attention. When she saw me, she paused, mid-sentence, and her whole group turned to look. For a moment, we just made eye contact across the hallway, and I saw something in her expression that was worse than disgust or fear or even pity. It was amusement, a tiny smile playing at the corner of her mouth, quickly suppressed but unmistakable, like she was trying not to laugh. This wasn't traumatic for her, it wasn't difficult, it was entertaining. My humiliation was a story she'd tell later, a funny anecdote about the weird quiet kid who didn't understand how the world worked, who'd briefly made her life slightly more interesting before fading back into irrelevance. I turned and walked in the opposite direction, heard laughter from her group that might have been related to me, or might have been about something else entirely. But in that moment, the distinction didn't matter. The thing that had felt brave and vulnerable and important when I was writing it, the letter that represented me finally being honest about real feeling, had become a punchline to a story I wasn't even the main character in. That's when the rumors started about why I'd really been interested in her. The first I heard of it was Friday afternoon, when someone I barely knew, a junior named Tyler something, made a comment in passing about gold diggers not knowing their place. I didn't understand what he meant at first, thought maybe it was unrelated to me, but then I started hearing variations of the same theme. People were saying I hadn't really liked Vanessa as a person, that I'd just been trying to use her to get access to her family's money and connections. They pointed to the fact that I came from a struggling background, that my family was basically poor, that of course someone like me would try to social climb by targeting someone like her. The narrative shifted from pathetic boy with unrequited crush to calculating opportunist trying to exploit naive rich girl, and somehow that version spread even faster because it gave people license to be actively hostile rather than just mockingly sympathetic. Pity had social costs. It required at least pretending to think I deserved basic human decency. But contempt for a perceived schemer was socially costless, even rewarding, because it meant you were defending someone vulnerable against predatory behavior. I started hearing comments that were less whispered and more openly contemptuous. In calculus, someone made a joke about checking your wallet when certain people were around, and half the class laughed while looking directly at me. Someone left a fake dollar bill in my locker with a note saying, "Here's your allowance, maybe now you'll leave actual wealthy people alone." In the cafeteria, someone at a nearby table made a loud conversation about how you could always tell when people were raised without class, and several people immediately glanced at me to make sure I'd heard. The worst part was that I couldn't defend myself because any defense would sound like confirmation. If I insisted I genuinely liked Vanessa for who she was, it would just prove I still didn't understand why the whole thing was inappropriate. If I tried to explain that my family was middle class, not poor, it would look like I was ashamed of my background and desperate to distance myself from it. And if I just stayed silent, people would interpret that as guilt or shame or acceptance of the narrative they'd constructed. There was no winning move. My small friend group tried to be supportive, but they were also clearly uncomfortable with the attention proximity to me was bringing them. We'd always been invisible together, and suddenly I'd made us visible in the worst possible way. They'd still sit with me at lunch, but conversations became strained, and I could feel them pulling back, creating distance to protect themselves from the contamination of my social death. I didn't blame them exactly, but it meant the isolation was nearly complete. My grades started slipping because I couldn't focus. I'd sit in class and try to follow the lesson, but my brain would just loop through the same humiliating moments, reprocessing them endlessly, looking for alternative paths I could have taken. I'd lie awake at night running through scenarios where I'd played it differently, where I'd never written the letter, or where I'd somehow predicted the public response and protected myself. The what-ifs were torture because they illuminated exactly how avoidable this all was, how completely it was the result of my own misguided choices. Thanksgiving break that year was a relief because it meant I didn't have to be at school, but it was also difficult because I was home with my parents, and they could tell something was wrong, but I couldn't explain what. My father asked a few times if everything was okay, if there was anything he could help with, and I just deflected with vague comments about stress and junior year being harder than I expected. My mother suggested I see a counselor, said the school had resources for students who were struggling, and I nodded and said I'd think about it, while knowing I'd never follow through, because the last thing I needed was more adults getting involved and potentially making this an official issue that would become part of my permanent record. When I returned to school after the break, I'd made a decision. I was going to completely withdraw. No more trying to defend myself. No more hoping things would blow over. No more attempting to maintain social connections that were clearly failing. I was going to become actually invisible, to minimize my presence so thoroughly that people would forget about me and move on to other drama. I stopped making eye contact in hallways, stopped participating in class unless directly called on, stopped going anywhere that wasn't absolutely necessary. I ate lunch alone in the library, claiming I needed to study. I left immediately when school ended rather than lingering for any reason. It worked mostly. The active mockery faded as people found other things to focus on. Vanessa moved on completely, back to her normal life of being admired and central, and the story of the weird kid who'd written her a creepy letter became just one anecdote among many in her collection of high school experiences. I became background again, which was what I'd wanted, but the invisibility felt different now. Before, I'd been unseen by choice, comfortable in my irrelevance. Now, I was unseen by necessity, hiding because exposure meant pain. The rest of junior year passed in this diminished state. I kept my grades from completely collapsing, maintained the minimum necessary to stay on track for college, but I'd lost the quiet pleasure I used to take in academic achievement. Everything felt mechanical, just going through motions to get to some future point where this would all be behind me. I applied to colleges with a strategy of maximum distance, choosing schools in other parts of the country where no one would know me and I could start fresh without the weight of this story following me. My parents noticed I'd changed, but they attributed it to normal teenage moodiness combined with college stress. I was quieter, more withdrawn, but I was still functional, still doing what I needed to do, so they didn't push too hard. Sometimes my mother would ask if I wanted to talk about anything, and I'd say no, and she'd respect that boundary, while clearly not believing that everything was actually fine. But what could I tell her? That I'd been humiliated by a rich girl and her friends, and now had to survive another year and a half at a school where everyone knew I'd failed spectacularly at understanding my own social position? It would just make her feel helpless, and possibly prompt her to get involved, which would make everything worse. Senior year started with a new strategy. I'd accepted that high school was essentially over for me in any meaningful social sense, so I focused entirely on exit velocity. I took the hardest classes I could handle, volunteered for any opportunity that would look good on college applications, and treated every day as one day closer to escape. I became friendly with teachers in a way I never had before, because adults were safe. They weren't participants in the social hierarchy that had destroyed me. I'd stay after class to discuss material in more depth, volunteer to help with administrative tasks, position myself as the reliable student who could be counted on. One teacher in particular, Mr. Theodore Harlow, who taught AP economics, seemed to recognize something in me. He was in his late 50s, had worked in finance before becoming a teacher, and brought a practical cynicism to the subject that I found refreshing. When we covered market dynamics and competitive strategy, he didn't just teach the theory. He talked about how actual businesses and individuals fought for advantage in ways that textbooks sanitized. He loaned me books that weren't on the curriculum, stuff about game theory and behavioral economics and the psychology of decision-making, and we'd have these long conversations after class about how systems actually worked versus how people pretended they worked. One day in early fall, we were talking about information asymmetry and strategic positioning, and he said something that stuck with me. He said most people go through life thinking success is about being better, being smarter, working harder, but that's only part of it. The real advantage comes from seeing the game more clearly than other people do, from understanding the actual rules rather than the official rules, and from being patient enough to position yourself before anyone realizes what you're doing. He wasn't advocating anything unethical exactly, just acknowledging that power and success followed patterns that were more complex than simple merit. I asked him how someone with fewer resources was supposed to compete against people who started with every advantage, and he didn't give me platitudes about hard work and determination. He said the only real option was asymmetric strategy, finding leverage points that the powerful overlooked because they didn't need them. He said wealthy people got comfortable, sloppy, dependent on their advantages lasting forever, and that created openings for people who were willing to be more careful, more patient, more strategic. And then he looked at me with this expression that suggested he knew more about my situation than I'd told him. And he said, "Sometimes the best move is to disappear for a while, to let people forget about you so they stop watching you, and to come back when you're ready rather than when they expect it." I thought about that conversation constantly. It reframed my humiliation as potentially strategic rather than just traumatic. If I'd made myself too visible, drawn too much negative attention, then maybe the right move was exactly what I was already doing, withdrawing completely, becoming unremarkable again, so that no one was tracking my actual development. And if I was going to eventually compete with people like Vanessa Prescott, people who'd been born into advantage and had never had to think about how to get it, then I needed to be building capacity in ways they wouldn't notice or understand until it was too late. I started reading everything I could find about business strategy, corporate finance, investment structures, mergers and acquisitions. I taught myself to read financial statements, to understand debt structures, to recognize when companies were stronger or weaker than they appeared on the surface. I spent hours in the library going through business publications, tracking how deals happened, how power shifted, how vulnerable positions could be exploited by patient actors with specific knowledge. None of this was for school, it was for me. For some vague future, I was starting to imagine where understanding these systems might matter. My college applications were strategic too. I applied to schools with strong business and economics programs, but I also looked for places that offered financial aid, generous enough that I wouldn't graduate drowning in debt. I needed to get educated without becoming dependent on loan structures that would limit my options later. I wrote essays about overcoming obstacles and developing resilience, carefully crafting narratives that acknowledged difficulty without revealing the specific humiliation I was actually recovering from. I got into several good schools and ultimately chose a strong state university with an honors program and a scholarship package that would leave me financially solvent. The last few months of high school were strange. I'd become so thoroughly disconnected from the social environment that I moved through it like a ghost. I'd see Vanessa occasionally, still beautiful and confident and successful, applying to elite private schools and talking about internships at her father's company and planning some graduation trip to Europe with her friends. We never spoke, never even made eye contact anymore, and I'd trained myself to feel nothing when I saw her, to treat her like any other irrelevant stranger. The anger and hurt had burned down into something colder and more patient, a kind of background determination that didn't need to be fed by active hatred. Graduation was anticlimactic. I sat with my small group of friends who I'd grown even more distant from, and we went through the ceremony mechanically, and afterward I escaped as quickly as possible, while most people went to parties I wasn't invited to and wouldn't have attended anyway. My parents took me out to dinner at a nice restaurant, nicer than we usually went to, and they talked about how proud they were, and how college would be a fresh start, and how I should make the most of the opportunities ahead. I nodded and agreed and felt the enormous relief of knowing I'd never have to see most of these people again. That summer before college, I worked 2 jobs, one doing data entry at my mother's dental practice and another doing evening shifts at a shipping facility. I saved almost everything I earned, building up a cushion beyond what my scholarships and financial aid would cover, and I spent my free time continuing to read about business and finance and strategy. My parents thought I was just being responsible, preparing for college expenses, and they were right, but they didn't understand the deeper motivation. I wasn't just trying to be comfortable in college. I was trying to build the foundation for something larger that I couldn't quite articulate yet. There was one strange interruption to this pattern. In late July, a lawyer contacted me about an estate matter. My godfather, Gabriel Thornton, had passed away. I'd barely known him, honestly. He was my father's friend from childhood, someone who'd moved away for work before I was born and who I'd only met a handful of times at family gatherings. He'd stayed in touch with my father through occasional phone calls and Christmas cards, but we weren't close. The lawyer explained that Mr. Thornton had named me as a beneficiary in his will, which was surprising, and that I needed to come to his office to discuss the inheritance. I went with my father, both of us confused about what this could possibly be. The lawyer's office was downtown, professional and serious, and we sat across from a middle-aged man named Harrison Caldwell, who had that particular manner of someone delivering information they found routine, but which would be significant to the recipients. He explained that Gabriel Thornton had been a successful businessman, one of the early partners in Prescott Construction Holdings before he sold his stake and moved into other ventures. He'd invested well, lived modestly, never married, and had apparently decided to leave certain assets to specific people who'd mattered to him in various ways. For me, he left a single asset, a block of shares in Prescott Construction Holdings, representing about 4% of the company. At current valuation, the lawyer explained, that was worth approximately $200,000. But there was a condition attached. I couldn't sell the shares for 10 years from the date of inheritance. They would sit in a trust, managed by a financial firm, and I couldn't touch the principal until I was 28. However, as a shareholder, I would have certain rights, specifically access to company financial information and voting rights in board decisions if I chose to exercise them. I sat there trying to process what I was hearing. Gabriel Thornton had been a partner in Vanessa Prescott's family company. He'd left me shares in that company, shares I couldn't sell but could use to access information about how the business operated. It was so specific and strange that it had to be intentional, but I couldn't imagine why. The lawyer offered no insight into motivation, just handed over the legal documents that formalized the inheritance and explained the trust structure that would hold the shares for the next decade. My father was stunned and kept asking if there was some mistake, but the lawyer confirmed everything was correct and legal. On the drive home, my father talked about what an unexpected blessing this was, how Gabriel must have thought highly of me even though we hadn't been close, how the money would be there in 10 years when I might really need it for a house or starting a family. He was thinking about it as a generous gift, a financial cushion for my future. But I was thinking about the specifics. 4% wasn't enough to control anything, but it was enough to matter in certain circumstances. 10 years meant I'd be almost 30 when I could sell, which was a long time to hold an asset, but it also meant the gift was about something other than immediate liquidity. And the access to financial information suggested that the value might be in knowledge rather than in the shares themselves. Gabriel Thornton had been partners with Vanessa's father. He'd left her family's company, apparently by choice, and decades later he'd given me a piece of it, with conditions that made it useful for observation rather than profit. I didn't tell anyone else about this. Not my mother beyond the basic fact of the inheritance. Not my friends. Certainly not anyone at school. It felt private and strange and potentially significant in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I asked the lawyer how I would access the financial information, and he connected me with the firm managing the trust. They explained that as a shareholder, I could request quarterly reports and annual filings, that I'd be notified of major corporate decisions that required shareholder voting, and that I had the right to attend board meetings as an observer if I wanted, though at 4% my vote wouldn't sway anything. I requested every available document about the company's recent history. The firm sent me thick folders of financial statements, reports on current projects, debt structures, investor relations materials. I spent the last few weeks before college going through all of it, teaching myself to decode the information, to understand what the numbers were actually saying beneath the official narratives. Prescott Construction Holdings was large and complex, with multiple subsidiaries and project partnerships and complicated financing arrangements. They were successful by most measures, but they were also highly leveraged, carrying significant debt to fund expansion and maintain operations. When I left for college in August, I took copies of all those documents with me. I didn't know what I was going to do with them, if anything, but I knew they represented something important. Gabriel Thornton had given me a window into the Prescott empire, and given the circumstances of the previous year, it was hard to believe that was purely coincidental. College was everything I'd hoped it would be, and also nothing like I expected. The campus was large and impersonal enough that I could be truly anonymous, which was initially liberating after the claustrophobic social environment of high school, where everyone knew everyone's business and your reputation followed you everywhere. The state university I'd chosen had about 30,000 students across all levels, which meant you could walk across campus and barely see the same face twice if you chose your routes and timing carefully. No one knew about the humiliation I'd suffered. No one had preconceptions about who I was or where I belonged. No one was watching me with the particular combination of pity and contempt that had become my default reception junior and senior year. I could construct a new identity from scratch, and I chose to be someone serious, focused, professionally oriented from day one. During freshman orientation, when people were bonding over drinking games and late-night pizza runs and all the typical college social rituals, I was in my dorm room reviewing the course catalog and planning out my academic trajectory for the next 4 years. I knew what I needed to learn, and I knew I didn't have time to waste on the social performance of being a typical college student. While my roommate was pledging a fraternity and coming back drunk at 3 a.m, I was creating spreadsheets of required courses and electives, organized by what skills they'd teach me, rather than what grades I could get with minimal effort. I declared a double major in economics and finance at the end of first semester, when most students were still exploring general education requirements. The advisor I met with was skeptical, pointing out that carrying 2 majors in related but distinct fields would require careful planning and wouldn't leave much room for exploration or changing my mind. I told him I was certain about my path and could handle the workload, and when he pulled up my first semester grades showing straight A's, including in courses most freshmen struggled with, he stopped pushing back and just signed the paperwork. The economics courses taught me theory and modeling, how to think about incentives and market structures and equilibrium conditions. I learned how rational actors were supposed to behave in different situations, what information asymmetries created opportunities for exploitation, how institutions developed to solve coordination problems. The finance courses were more practical, focused on valuation techniques and capital structure decisions in portfolio management. But what connected them was understanding how money and power actually moved. what created value and what just looked like it created value, how careful analysis could identify gaps between perception and reality. I took on a heavier course load than most students, usually 18 or 19 credits per semester when the standard was 15. My parents worried I was burning out, pushing too hard, not giving myself time to enjoy the college experience. But I didn't want to enjoy it in any traditional sense. I wanted to use it to build capacity as quickly as possible. Every class I wasn't taking was a class I couldn't learn from. Every semester I didn't overload was 6 months longer before I'd have all the tools I needed. I made friends but kept them at a distance, never letting anyone get close enough to know the full story of where I'd come from or what had driven me here. I'd study with people from my classes, participate in group projects, go to the occasional social event when it felt professionally useful, but I never shared anything real about my background or my motivations. When people asked why I worked so hard or what I was planning to do after graduation, I'd give generic answers about wanting to work in finance or maybe consulting, ambitious but not specifically revealing. I joined the investment club second semester of freshman year, and this was where I started seriously building practical skills beyond just theory. The club managed a small portfolio of real money, about $50,000 donated by alumni, and we met weekly to discuss positions and hear pitches from members about potential investments. Most of the members were juniors and seniors who'd already completed several finance courses, so as a freshman I was out of my depth initially, but I listened carefully, took detailed notes, asked clarifying questions that showed I was trying to learn rather than trying to show off, and gradually built credibility as someone worth taking seriously. The club president, a senior named Jonathan somebody, noticed that I was actually reading the annual reports and financial filings for companies we discussed, rather than just skimming headlines and analyst summaries. He started asking me to present analysis on specific companies, giving me assignments that would force me to really dig into the numbers and understand what they meant. I'd spend entire weekends building valuation models in Excel, reading through debt covenants and management discussion sections of 10KS, trying to understand not just what a company was worth, but how stable that value was and what could change it. I participated in case competitions organized by consulting firms and investment banks that recruited on campus. Teams of students analyzing business scenarios and presenting recommendations within tight time constraints. These were high-pressure simulations of real professional work, and I was consistently good at them. Not necessarily the most charismatic presenter, but reliably strong on analysis and strategic thinking. I placed highly in several competitions, which got me noticed by recruiters, and built a reputation within the business school as someone technically capable. I volunteered to work on research projects for professors who were studying market dynamics and corporate strategy. One professor, Dr. Sebastian Blackwood, was researching how companies responded to activist investors, specifically looking at patterns in when management accommodated activist demands versus fought them. I helped him build the data set, coding through hundreds of activist campaigns and tracking outcomes. The work was tedious but educational, showing me in granular detail how minority shareholders with specific strategies could force change in companies much larger than their ownership stakes would suggest. Dr. Blackwood and I would have long conversations in his office about the research, and he'd ask me questions that were clearly testing whether I understood the deeper implications of what we were finding. Why did some companies fold immediately to activist pressure while others fought for years? What made boards vulnerable to minority shareholder campaigns? How did activists identify targets that were likely to be susceptible to their strategies? I'd worked through these questions analytically, and he'd push back on my assumptions, force me to think more carefully about power dynamics and information advantages, and how legal frameworks created leverage points. He eventually told me I should consider law school, or at least take some corporate law courses, that the interface between law and finance was where a lot of the real interesting action happened. I followed his advice and started loading my schedule with business law courses in addition to the economics and finance requirements. I learned about fiduciary duties and shareholder rights, about how boards were structured and what constraints govern their decision-making, about the difference between voting control and economic ownership, and how those could be separated through clever structuring. The internships I pursued were strategic too, chosen for what I could learn, rather than prestige or compensation. Freshman summer I worked unpaid for a small venture capital firm in a mid-sized city about 2 hours away, commuting back and forth several days a week because I couldn't afford to sublet an apartment there. The firm invested in early-stage technology companies, and my job was essentially to do diligence grunt work, reading through business plans and financial projections and trying to assess which entrepreneurs were realistic versus which ones were just telling attractive stories. I learned how to evaluate whether companies were actually viable or just good at getting people excited about possibilities. I learned to spot the red flags in projections that were too optimistic, in management teams that had gaps nobody was acknowledging, in business models that assumed things about customer behavior that weren't supported by evidence. Most of the companies we looked at didn't get funded, and understanding why they failed the smell test was more educational than studying the few that got investment. Sophomore summer 1, worked for a corporate restructuring consultant who helped troubled businesses figure out whether to reorganize or liquidate. This was grimmer work, spending time in struggling companies trying to understand whether they could be saved and what saving would require. I'd build financial models showing cash flow under different scenarios, identify which parts of the business were generating value and which parts were destroying it, help craft proposals for how creditors might be reorganized to give the company breathing room. I learned how companies failed in specific, predictable ways, how profitable operations could be strangled by debt service obligations from growth initiatives that hadn't panned out, how management teams would hold on to hope far longer than was rational, spending scarce resources trying to save divisions that should have been shut down months earlier, how creditors with different positions in the capital structure had different incentives and how those conflicts could be exploited or managed depending on your position. That summer, I also watched several companies go through Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and I learned how the bankruptcy process worked in practice rather than theory. How automatic stays gave companies temporary breathing room from creditors, how debtor-in-possession financing worked, and who provided it, and what they demanded in return. How unsecured creditors almost never recovered anything meaningful, while secured creditors could sometimes get paid in full. How equity holders got wiped out, but sometimes management teams somehow stayed employed through the restructuring. Junior year, I started seriously studying corporate law, taking every relevant course the business school offered and supplementing with readings from law school syllabi I could find online. I read case studies of hostile takeovers and activist investor campaigns, learned about tender offers and proxy fights and green mail and all the various tactics that had been used and counter tactics that had been developed. I learned about poison pills and staggered boards and all the defensive mechanisms companies used to protect management from shareholder pressure. I learned about how minority shareholders could sometimes punch above their weight if they understood the rules and used them strategically. My professors thought I was just academically ambitious, preparing for law school or a high-level finance career, and that was partially true, but not the whole truth. I was building a specific toolkit for a specific purpose that I still couldn't quite articulate even to myself. I was learning how power worked at the corporate level, how it could be acquired and exercised and protected, how formal authority and economic interest could be separated and leveraged against each other. Throughout all of this, I continued requesting quarterly reports from Prescott Construction Holdings, tracking their operations from a distance. The trust management firm would send me thick packets of financial statements and operational updates every 3 months, and I'd spend hours going through them in detail, updating my models of their business and financial structure. To anyone who asked, I'd say it was just a way to practice financial analysis on a real company I had a connection to, which was true but incomplete. The company continued to expand during my college years, taking on larger and more complex projects, building in new markets, investing heavily in equipment and facilities. Their revenue grew steadily, which would have looked impressive to casual observers, but their debt grew even faster. They were operating on the classic growth through leverage model, borrowing to fund expansion on the assumption that growth would continue indefinitely, and that they could always refinance debt with new debt because banks would always see them as a safe investment. I started building detailed models of their financial structure in my junior year, sophisticated enough that my finance professors would have been impressed if they'd seen them. I'd model out different scenarios. What would happen if their access to credit tightened, if interest rates rose, if several projects went bad simultaneously, if the construction market turned down. I ran stress tests showing at what point their debt service obligations would exceed their cash flow, what covenants they were likely to violate first, what that would trigger in terms of creditor rights. It started as an academic exercise, just a way to practice the skills I was learning, but it became something more as I got better at understanding their specific vulnerabilities. The company was complex enough, with enough subsidiaries and project partnerships and interlinked obligations, that most casual observers would think it was strong and well managed, but someone who really dug into the details could see the fragility beneath the surface, could see that they'd built an empire on leverage, and that leverage cut both ways. Senior year, I started getting serious job offers from the internships and competitions I'd participated in. Several investment banks wanted to hire me for analyst programs. Consulting firms made offers. One venture capital firm said they'd create a position for me if I wanted to work there. The offers were flattering and well compensated, starting salaries in the $60,000 to $70,000 range, which felt like enormous money compared to what my parents made. But I was strategic in what I chose. I accepted a position at a mid-sized investment bank that specialized in distressed debt. It wasn't the most glamorous job, not Goldman or Morgan Stanley, or one of the names that people bragged about at reunions, but it was exactly what I needed to learn next. Distressed debt investing meant buying the obligations of struggling companies at a discount, and then either helping them restructure or controlling their restructuring process to maximize recovery. It meant understanding bankruptcy law intimately, negotiation tactics, how to turn other people's failures into your own opportunities. The work was brutal from day one, 80-hour weeks that regularly extended into weekends when deals were active or deadlines looming. The office was in a mid-rise building downtown, open floor plan with rows of desks where junior analysts sat hunched over multiple monitors running financial models and drafting presentation materials. The senior partners had actual offices with doors and windows, and the space between junior and senior was measured not just in compensation, but in basic dignity and control over your own schedule. My days started early, usually in the office by 7, and rarely ended before 8 or 9 at night. The work itself was intellectually demanding, but also emotionally draining in ways I hadn't quite anticipated. We were analyzing failing companies, businesses where people's livelihoods were at stake, and our job was to calculate how much value could be extracted from the wreckage. I'd read through bankruptcy filings and see lists of creditors that included small suppliers who'd probably never recover what they were owed, employees whose pension funds were in jeopardy, communities that would lose major employers. But I learned to develop the necessary emotional detachment, to see these situations as puzzles to be solved, rather than tragedies to be mourned. My colleagues, mostly people in their late 20s and early 30s who'd survived several years in this grinding environment, reinforced this approach. They'd make dark jokes about companies we were circling, call struggling businesses by nicknames that reduced them to their most glaring failures. Talk about investments in terms of pure returns without any reference to the human consequences of the restructurings we'd engineer. I learned fast, partly because I'd come in with more preparation than most analysts, and partly because I was intensely motivated in ways that had nothing to do with career advancement for its own sake. Within my first 6 months, I'd worked on 3 major distressed debt investments, learning the patterns of how these deals worked, from initial identification through acquisition, through restructuring or liquidation. The first deal I worked on involved a regional retail chain that had expanded too aggressively and taken on too much debt, right before consumer spending patterns shifted away from brick-and-mortar shopping. I was assigned to build the financial model, showing what the company's assets would be worth in liquidation versus restructuring scenarios, and to analyze the recovery rates different classes of creditors would see under each outcome. The work required understanding the company's real estate holdings, inventory values, brand equity, and dozens of other components that had to be separately valued and then integrated into a comprehensive picture. My team lead, a vice president, named Dominic Rivera, who'd been doing this for 8 years, would review my work and point out assumptions I'd made that were too generous or too conservative, forcing me to recalibrate how I was thinking about value. He'd ask questions like, why did I think the inventory was worth 70 cents on the dollar when similar retailers had only recovered 50 cents? Or why was I assuming the real estate could be sold at current market values when distressed sales typically came at significant discounts? The process taught me to be ruthlessly realistic about value, to strip away the optimistic assumptions that management teams and equity holders clung to, and focus on what assets would actually command in stressed transactions. We ultimately acquired a significant portion of the company's bank debt at 65 cents on the dollar from nervous lenders who wanted out before things got worse. And then we drove the company into Chapter 11 bankruptcy, where we controlled the restructuring process as the largest creditor group. We recovered about 90 cents on the dollar through a combination of liquidating stores and selling the brand and remaining operations to a larger retailer, generating significant returns for our fund. The second deal was a manufacturing company that had lost a major contract and couldn't service its debt without that revenue stream. This was a different dynamic because the company was actually operationally sound, just over-leveraged for its new revenue reality. We worked on a debt-for-equity conversion that gave our fund majority ownership in exchange for forgiving a portion of the obligations we'd acquired. And then we brought in new management to right-size operations and eventually sell the company to a strategic acquirer. I learned about the difference between companies that were broken fundamentally versus companies that just had bad capital structures, and how sometimes the highest returns came from fixing the latter rather than liquidating the former. The third deal was the most educational for my long-term purposes. It involved a construction and engineering firm that had overextended on several large public infrastructure projects, taken on too much debt to finance the equipment and bonding requirements, and was now struggling as project delays and cost overruns ate into profitability. The structure was complex with multiple layers of debt, cross guarantees between subsidiaries, bonding company obligations, and project-specific financing that all had to be understood in relation to each other. I spent weeks mapping out the entire capital structure, identifying which creditors had priority claims on which assets, understanding how the bonding company's interests aligned or conflicted with different debt holders, modeling how the unwinding would proceed under different scenarios. Dominic noticed the depth of work I was putting into understanding this particular situation and asked if I had personal interest in the construction sector. I said I just found it intellectually interesting because of the complexity, which was true but not the whole truth. We ended up passing on that investment because the recovery scenarios weren't attractive enough relative to the capital required and the time horizon involved. but I'd learned an enormous amount about how construction companies could fail, even when they had real operational capabilities, how project-based businesses created specific vulnerabilities in their financial structures, how bonding and equipment financing created complications that retail or manufacturing bankruptcies didn't have. My colleagues thought I was just particularly conscientious, someone who did thorough work even on deals we didn't pursue. But I was also building a specific knowledge base about construction company failures that would be directly applicable to Prescott Construction Holdings when the right time came. Between the demanding day job and my continued private analysis of Prescott's deteriorating financial position, I had essentially no personal life. I'd go to the office early, work until late, go home to my small apartment, maybe spend an hour or two on my own research before falling asleep, and repeat. Weekends were for catching up on work I couldn't finish during the week, and for diving deeper into Prescott's quarterly filings. Some of my colleagues would go out drinking after work, or plan expensive weekend trips to decompress, and they'd invite me occasionally in that perfunctory way people do when they expect you to decline. I'd always decline, politely but definitely, and eventually they stopped asking. I knew what they thought, that I was a boring grind who didn't know how to enjoy the rewards of success, and I didn't bother correcting them because their perception didn't matter to what I was trying to accomplish. I kept living cheaply despite my analyst salary of $75,000, which felt like enormous money compared to how I'd grown up. My apartment was a studio in a less desirable neighborhood. Bare furniture from IKEA, no decorations beyond what was necessary for function. I took the subway instead of cabs, brought lunch from home instead of ordering in, avoided all the lifestyle inflation that my colleagues engaged in as they started making real money. I saved aggressively, putting away more than half my after-tax income, building capital that I knew I'd need eventually for purposes I still couldn't entirely articulate. The 2008 financial crisis hit during my second year at the bank, and the distressed debt market exploded with opportunities. Companies that had looked stable suddenly couldn't refinance their debt. Credit markets froze up, and we had more potential investments than we had capital to pursue. The work became even more intense, 100-hour weeks becoming almost routine, as we tried to evaluate opportunities and move quickly before other investors grabbed the best positions. I continued tracking Prescott Construction Holdings through all of this, and the crisis hit them hard, though not as catastrophically as it hit some construction firms. They'd survived, but they'd had to take on even more debt to maintain operations through the downturn, accepting terms that would have been unthinkable in normal credit environments. They'd bet on rapid recovery and continued growth, restructured obligations to push maturities out several years, and committed to aggressive repayment schedules that would only work if the construction market bounced back quickly and robustly. But recovery came slower than anyone expected, and by 2010, Prescott was clearly struggling even though their public statements continued to project confidence. I could see it in the numbers, in the way their cash flow from operations barely covered debt service, in the way they were drawing down revolving credit lines just to meet payroll and vendor obligations, in the way they were selling off non-core assets to generate cash for operations. I started building detailed scenarios for how Prescott would fail if the stress continued. What covenants would they violate first? Which creditors would have the right to accelerate their claims? How the cascade of defaults would proceed if one major creditor decided to pull the trigger? How bankruptcy would likely play out given the structure of their secured and unsecured obligations? How much value different stakeholder groups would recover under different restructuring scenarios? This analysis went far beyond anything I'd do for a normal investment opportunity. I was mapping out the company's vulnerabilities with a precision that bordered on obsessive, identifying exactly where the leverage points were, where someone with the right position could apply pressure most effectively, where minority shareholders could coordinate to have influence beyond their nominal ownership stakes. By the time I was 26 and had been at the bank for about 4 years, I had become one of the more successful analysts in my group. I'd worked on over a dozen major distress situations, generated strong returns, and earned the respect of the senior partners who made the actual investment decisions. I was being considered for promotion to associate, which would come with significant salary increase and more autonomy in choosing which deals to pursue. But I was also getting restless. The work I was doing was helping other people, the fund's limited partners and the senior partners who owned the firm, generate wealth from distressed situations. I was well compensated, but I was still fundamentally an employee, doing analysis and execution work that others would monetize, and I was watching windows of opportunity on Prescott potentially close as time passed, as their situation either improved enough that they'd survive or deteriorated enough that other investors would spot the opportunity and beat me to it. I started quietly reaching out to other Prescott minority shareholders, people who held small stakes and had become increasingly frustrated with company management. The major institutional investors still believed the Prescotts could turn things around, or at least they weren't ready to write off their investments yet, but smaller shareholders were more nervous. I positioned myself as someone who shared their concerns and might be interested in coordinating our positions to have more influence over the company's direction. I wasn't proposing anything specific yet, just building relationships and understanding where different pieces were positioned. At the same time, through my work in distressed debt, I started identifying who held Prescott's major debt obligations: banks, bond holders, equipment financing companies, project partners who'd extended credit for specific developments. Some of these creditors were patient, willing to work with the company to restructure obligations and give them time to recover, but others were nervous and might be willing to sell their debt positions at a discount rather than risk complete loss if the company collapsed. When I turned 28, the 10-year restriction on my inherited shares expired. I could now sell them if I wanted, but I didn't. Instead, I used them as collateral to raise capital for a new venture. I'd spent years building relationships in the investment world, and I found partners who understood what I was trying to do. We created a small investment firm focused on distressed situations in the construction and real estate sectors, and my inherited shares in Prescott provided both credibility and alignment with our first major target. Over the next 18 months, we quietly bought Prescott debt from nervous creditors who were happy to get 70 or 80 cents on the dollar rather than risk getting nothing. We coordinated with minority shareholders who were tired of being ignored by Prescott management and who were willing to vote their shares according to strategies we proposed. We built detailed financial models showing exactly how much the company was worth in different scenarios, from successful restructuring to complete liquidation, and we positioned ourselves to profit from any outcome except the status quo continuing unchanged. By the time I was 29, our firm controlled or had contractual rights to enough Prescott debt that we could force a restructuring if we chose to. Combined with the minority shareholders we'd aligned with, we had enough combined influence to block or approve major corporate decisions. We didn't control the company outright, but we controlled its future, because the Prescotts couldn't move forward with any plan to save the business without our cooperation. The Prescotts finally realized how vulnerable they'd become when we filed formal notice of our debt positions and shareholder intentions with the SEC. It became public information that a small investment firm led by someone named Just Me, though few people would immediately connect to the quiet kid from high school, now held effective veto power over their family empire's survival. They tried to negotiate with the major banks, looking for refinancing that would let them pay off our debt and remove our leverage, but banks weren't willing to extend new credit on terms the Prescotts could afford. They tried to find new equity investors, but potential investors saw the debt structure and wanted terms that would severely dilute the family's ownership. Their options were narrowing. They could let the company collapse into bankruptcy, which would destroy most of their wealth and legacy, They could accept a restructuring that would cost them majority control, but might let them keep some role in a smaller, healthier company. Or they could try to negotiate directly with us to find some solution that preserved more of their position. That's when I got a call from their attorneys, very professional and formal, requesting a meeting to discuss potential paths forward. I agreed, but specified that any serious conversation would need to include the senior Prescotts themselves, not just lawyers and intermediaries. 2 weeks later, I found myself driving toward the house I'd only seen from the road when I was 16. The estate where the family that had once represented everything I couldn't have now waited to negotiate with me. The driveway was as long as I remembered, lined with mature trees and careful landscaping that spoke to generations of wealth and taste. The house itself was imposing without being ostentatious. Traditional architecture, executed at a scale that declared permanence and consequence. I parked in the circular drive, next to several expensive cars that probably belonged to family members and advisors, and for just a moment I let myself feel the strangeness of this reversal, how completely the geometry of power had inverted. A woman who was, probably household staff, opened the door and guided me to a dining room where several people were already seated. At the head of the table was Maxwell Prescott, Vanessa's father, late 60s now, and showing the strain of the past few years. Next to him sat a man I didn't recognize, but who introduced himself as the company's general counsel. And across from them sat Vanessa herself, looking different than I remembered, but still recognizably the same person who destroyed my high school reputation. She'd aged well, which wasn't surprising given her advantages. Late 20s, and beautiful in that particular way that came from good genetics maintained by the kind of care money bought. She was dressed professionally, business casual for a family dinner, and she looked directly at me as I entered with an expression I couldn't quite read. There wasn't recognition exactly, or maybe there was, but it was buried under more immediate concern about what I represented for her family's future. Maxwell Prescott stood and extended his hand, very cordial and professional, thanking me for coming and suggesting we have drinks before dinner while we discuss the situation informally. I accepted a glass of wine I had no intention of actually drinking and sat down across from them. And for a few minutes we engaged in the kind of empty small talk that people use to delay difficult conversations. He asked about my background in finance, complimented the sophistication of our firm's strategy, acknowledged that we'd clearly done excellent analysis of their company's position. Then Vanessa spoke for the first time, and her voice had that same quality I remembered from high school, confident and clear and used to being listened to. She said she'd been looking through the shareholder records and noticed that my inherited shares had come from Gabriel Thornton, and that she vaguely remembered he'd been one of her father's early partners. She asked if that connection was what had initially drawn my attention to their company, said in a way that suggested she was just curious about the backstory. I said yes, the inheritance had made me aware of the company and given me access to information that helped me understand the industry. I didn't mention anything about high school or our history, kept my response purely professional. She nodded like this made sense, and said she just wanted to understand the personal context, if there was one, beneath the business relationship. Maxwell Prescott redirected the conversation to practical matters. He acknowledged that the company was facing challenges, but insisted they were temporary, that the underlying business was sound and just needed better capital structure and market conditions. He talked about projects in the pipeline that would generate significant returns, about relationships with public sector clients that provided reliable revenue, about the value of their reputation and expertise in a competitive industry. It was a practice pitch, the kind of thing he'd probably given to bankers and investors dozens of times, and it was designed to suggest that our firm would benefit more from supporting the company's recovery than from forcing a hostile restructuring. I let him finish, and then very calmly walked through what our analysis actually showed. I explained that the company's debt service obligations exceeded its free cash flow by a significant margin, that upcoming debt maturities would require refinancing at rates they couldn't afford, that several major projects were running over budget and behind schedule in ways that would impact profitability. I noted that their working capital position was deteriorating, that they'd been drawing down credit lines to meet payroll and vendor obligations, that their relationship with key suppliers was becoming strained as payment terms extended beyond normal business practices. I wasn't being cruel exactly, just precise and factual, but the effect was to completely deflate the optimistic narrative he'd been trying to construct. The general counsel shifted uncomfortably and tried to suggest that some of my information might be outdated or incomplete, but I referenced specific line items from their most recent internal financial reports, the ones that weren't public but that I had access to as a shareholder, and he went quiet. Vanessa was watching me with more focus now, and I could see her trying to figure out who I actually was beneath the professional presentation. There was something in her expression that suggested recognition was starting to form, but hadn't quite crystallized yet. Maxwell Prescott acknowledged that yes, they were facing challenges. That was why they'd wanted to meet, to discuss possible solutions that would work for everyone involved. He asked what our firm would need to support a restructuring that kept the Prescotts in operational control, what terms we'd find acceptable. I explained that our primary obligation was to our investors and the creditors whose debt we'd acquired. Any solution would need to maximize value recovery for those stakeholders. That meant either the company needed to rapidly improve its financial performance, which seemed unlikely given current trajectory, or ownership would need to be restructured to reflect economic reality. The most straightforward approach would be a debt-for-equity conversion that gave our firm and our partners majority control, while allowing the Prescott family to retain a significant minority stake and possibly ongoing operational roles, if that made strategic sense. The silence that followed was heavy. What I'd just outlined was the functional end of the Prescott family empire, as they'd known it. They'd go from owners who controlled their destiny to employees or minority stakeholders in a company that someone else ran. Maxwell Prescott's face showed him processing this, and I could see the moment when he understood that all the negotiation and persuasion in the world wouldn't change the fundamental mathematics of their position. Vanessa broke the silence. She said that seemed like an aggressive position, given that we'd acquired most of our debt holdings at significant discounts, that we stood to make substantial profits even with a more moderate restructuring that left her family in control. Her tone was sharp, with an edge of anger that suggested she thought we were being unreasonable or opportunistic. I looked at her directly for the first time and said that yes, we would profit from any outcome except the status quo continuing. But that was the nature of distressed investing. We'd taken on risk that other creditors were unwilling to bear. We'd provided liquidity when the company desperately needed it, and we deserved to be compensated for that. But I also said that our position wasn't just about maximizing our return. It was about ensuring the company's long-term viability and leaving the same management in control that had created the current situation didn't seem like a recipe for success. Maxwell Prescott tried one more angle. He suggested that perhaps we could structure something where our firm provided new capital in exchange for a smaller equity stake, enough to give us significant influence but not control, and in return, the Prescotts would implement specific operational changes and governance reforms we recommended. It was a reasonable compromise in many situations, but it assumed we wanted partnership when what we actually wanted was control. I said we'd consider any serious proposal, but that partial solutions had a tendency to fail. Half measures meant split authority and conflicting incentives, and companies that tried to restructure while maintaining old power structures usually just ended up back in trouble a few years later. If we were going to commit significant resources to fixing Prescott Construction Holdings, we needed clear authority to make decisions, without constant negotiation. They asked for time to think about it, to discuss options with their advisors and family members, and I agreed to a 2-week pause in any formal proceedings to give them space. But I also noted that the company's financial situation was deteriorating daily, that waiting had costs, and that our patience wasn't infinite. We moved into the formal dining room for dinner, which was surreal. Staff served multiple courses of carefully prepared food while we made awkward conversation about neutral topics, everyone pretending this was a normal social occasion rather than a negotiation about the transfer of generational wealth. Vanessa asked polite questions about where I live now, how I liked the city, whether I traveled much for work. I gave minimal answers and deflected with questions back to her about what she'd been doing, and she talked about working in the family business, learning different aspects of the operation, preparing to eventually take on more leadership responsibility in a future that was now very uncertain. Toward the end of the meal, as staff were clearing dishes, she suddenly said my name, my actual first name rather than just using professional distance. And when I looked up, she was staring at me with full recognition. She said she'd just realized where she knew me from, that we'd gone to the same high school, and I could see her mentally rewinding through our dinner conversation to reassess everything I'd said through that lens. I confirmed that yes, we'd briefly attended school together, though it had been a long time ago, and I didn't imagine she'd have much reason to remember me specifically. My tone was completely neutral, giving no indication that there was any history worth discussing, and I saw her trying to figure out if I was being genuinely casual or if there was something beneath the surface. Maxwell Prescott didn't seem to think this connection was particularly relevant and tried to move the conversation forward. But Vanessa was clearly processing something. She said something about how strange life was, how you never knew who people would become, and there was a question implicit in her statement that I chose not to answer. The dinner ended shortly after, with agreements to be in touch through our respective attorneys. I drove away from the estate watching it recede in my rearview mirror and felt nothing dramatic, no surge of triumph or satisfaction, just a kind of cold clarity about what came next. Over the next 2 weeks, the Prescott's attorneys sent several proposals, each trying to find some structure that would preserve family control while giving us sufficient economic upside to make it worthwhile. But every proposal had the same fundamental problem. They were trying to maintain power while we held all the leverage. Their best offers still left them in charge of operations, still left the Prescott name on the building, and Maxwell Prescott as chairman still preserved the appearance of continuity even as they conceded significant economic value. We rejected each proposal with detailed explanations of why it didn't meet our requirements. We weren't being arbitrary, we just had clarity about what we needed, and they kept hoping we'd accept less. The back and forth continued for several months, with them getting incrementally more desperate as their cash position deteriorated further. Then one evening I received a call from Vanessa directly, not through attorneys. She said she wanted to meet informally, just the two of us, to discuss whether there might be a path forward that the lawyers weren't seeing. Her tone was careful, professional, but with an undertone of something else, maybe urgency or maybe manipulation. I wasn't entirely sure. We met at a restaurant downtown, neutral territory, and she arrived looking polished and prepared. We ordered drinks and appetizers, and she started with small talk, asking about my life, my career, whether I'd stayed in touch with anyone from high school. I gave minimal responses and waited for her to get to the actual point. Finally, she said that she'd been thinking a lot about our high school connection since the dinner, and she wanted to acknowledge that things had happened back then that she wasn't proud of. She said she'd been young and thoughtless and caught up in social dynamics that seemed important at the time, but were actually just cruel. She said she'd hurt me, and she was sorry for that, and if she could go back and handle it differently, she would. I listened without reacting and asked if there was a business reason for this meeting, or if she just wanted to apologize for something that happened over a decade ago. My tone was neutral, not hostile, but not warm either, and she seemed thrown by my lack of visible emotion. She pivoted to the business angle. She said her family was willing to consider a full transition of control if we could structure it in a way that preserved some legacy, maybe kept the Prescott name, maybe retained her father in an advisory role with a consultancy contract, maybe kept some family members in operational positions where their expertise was genuine. She said they just needed to land this in a way that didn't feel like complete defeat, that acknowledged what her family had built even as control transferred. I asked what she was personally willing to contribute to make that happen. She looked confused and I clarified. If her family wanted terms that went beyond pure economic logic, that privileged legacy over efficiency, then they needed to bring something to the table beyond just asking nicely. What could she personally offer that would make accommodating these requests worthwhile? She was clearly uncomfortable, but said she'd be willing to work for the restructured company in whatever capacity made sense, bring her operational knowledge and relationships to support the transition. I asked about compensation expectations, and she said they could be reasonable, market-based rather than entitled. I told her I'd think about it and we could discuss further. The dinner ended without resolution, but with an implicit understanding that we were moving towards some kind of final negotiation. Over the next few weeks, her father's attorneys proposed a structure that was close to acceptable. Full transfer of control and majority ownership to our firm and our partners, with the Prescotts retaining a 15% stake, and Maxwell Prescott keeping a largely ceremonial board seat. They proposed that Vanessa would serve as VP of Business Development at a salary that was high but not outrageous, essentially buying her expertise and relationships at a premium to what we'd pay an outside hire. But they added one request that was purely about optics. They wanted to frame the transition as a partnership rather than a takeover, wanted press releases that talked about the Prescott family bringing in new capital partners to expand the business, rather than language that acknowledged they'd lost control due to financial distress. They were asking us to help them save face publicly, even as the reality was their complete loss of power. My partners thought we should just refuse this, that we'd won, and didn't need to accommodate their vanity, but I saw an opportunity. I told them I wanted to handle the final negotiation personally, and I wanted to do it at the Prescott estate with the same intimate setting as our first dinner. They thought I was being unnecessarily theatrical, but agreed to let me structure the final meeting. I called Vanessa and proposed one last dinner at their home. Just Maxwell, Vanessa, myself, and one attorney each for documentation purposes. I said if we could reach agreement on the final terms, we could sign that evening and begin the transition immediately. She agreed, probably relieved that we seemed close to resolution. The second dinner at the Prescott estate was smaller and more tense. Maxwell Prescott looked diminished compared to our first meeting, the months of stress and decline visible in his face and posture. Vanessa was composed but watchful, clearly uncertain about what I was actually after. Our attorneys sat at opposite ends of the table with documents ready. We went through the terms point by point: control structure, equity distribution, board composition, operational authority, compensation packages. Everything they'd proposed in their final offer was acceptable to us with minor modifications. Maxwell Prescott seemed almost relieved as we worked through the details, as if he'd expected us to demand even harsher terms at the last moment. Then I raised one additional item. I said that, given the significant restructuring and the capital demands involved, we'd need the Prescott family to demonstrate good faith commitment to the company's future. I proposed that they transfer their remaining liquid assets, approximately $3 million in cash and marketable securities that weren't tied up in company stock, into an escrow account that would serve as a performance guarantee. If the company met certain operational targets over the next 2 years, those assets would be returned to them. If the targets weren't met, the assets would be applied to company obligations. Maxwell Prescott looked confused and said that seemed unusual, that performance guarantees typically came from operational management, not from minority shareholders. His attorney started to object that this wasn't a standard provision in restructuring agreements. I said we weren't requiring it, but that if they wanted the legacy considerations they'd requested, if they wanted press releases that talked about partnership rather than failure, if they wanted to preserve the illusion that they were still meaningful stakeholders, rather than just employees of a company they no longer controlled, then this was the price. I said it was a meaningful gesture that aligned their interests with the company's success and gave our investors confidence that the Prescotts weren't just trying to extract whatever value they could before walking away. Vanessa asked what would happen if they refused, and I said then we'd move forward with the standard restructuring terms, which meant everything they'd negotiated for regarding legacy and face saving would disappear. The deal would be purely economic, with no accommodation for their emotional or reputational concerns. They asked for a private consultation and stepped out of the room. I could hear raised voices from the adjacent study, Maxwell and Vanessa arguing about whether they had any choice, whether this was a reasonable request or a manipulation, whether they could trust that I'd honor the rest of the agreement if they complied. They came back 20 minutes later and agreed. Maxwell Prescott's signature on the escrow documents was shaky, and Vanessa looked like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. We finished the formal agreements, both attorneys witnessing and notarizing, and as we were organizing the signed documents, I placed one additional folder in front of Maxwell Prescott. I said these were the actual terms of the escrow agreement, and he should review them carefully before the funds were transferred. He opened the folder and I watched his face change as he read. The escrow agreement wasn't structured as a performance guarantee that would return their money if targets were met. It was structured as a debt settlement payment, converting those assets into permanent payment against the debt our firm held, with no possibility of return regardless of company performance. The language was clear and legally binding, and it meant the $3 million they were about to transfer was gone forever, used to pay down obligations to us at favorable rates that maximized our return. He looked up at me with complete comprehension of what had just happened. Vanessa grabbed the folder and read it herself, and I saw her face flush with anger and something that looked like genuine fear. Maxwell Prescott started to say something about how this wasn't what we'd discussed, but I cut him off. I said it was exactly what we'd discussed. They would transfer their liquid assets as a good faith gesture related to the restructuring. The restructuring agreement itself was valid and enforceable. All the terms they'd negotiated were exactly as specified. They would retain their 15% stake, and Vanessa would have her VP position, and the press releases would use whatever language they wanted. But the escrow transfer, once executed, would be permanent debt settlement, and that was clearly specified in the documents they'd just signed. His attorney was flipping through pages, and I could see him realizing that yes, the language was there, buried in the technical provisions that most people skimmed because they assumed standard structure. Vanessa was saying this was fraud, that we'd misrepresented the terms, but her attorney was shaking his head because I hadn't misrepresented anything. I'd just let them assume based on my verbal description rather than the actual written terms. I stayed completely calm and said they had several options. They could refuse to transfer the funds, which would constitute a breach of the agreement they just signed, and would allow us to revert to a purely economic restructuring with no legacy considerations. They could transfer the funds according to the terms they'd agreed to, which would permanently reduce their liquid wealth, but preserve everything they'd negotiated for regarding their role in the company. Or they could try to fight it in court, though their attorney could probably explain how expensive and uncertain that would be, especially given that the written documents were clear, and they'd signed them with legal representation present. Maxwell Prescott looked at his attorney, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Fighting would cost more than $3 million in legal fees with very uncertain prospects of success. Refusing would trigger the reversion clause and cost them everything they'd negotiated for. The only rational move was to comply and accept the loss. Vanessa asked why I was doing this, what the point was beyond just maximizing our return. She asked if this was about high school, about what had happened between us, if I'd spent over a decade engineering revenge for teenage cruelty. I looked at her and said this was about business, about understanding value and leverage and how to structure transactions to achieve optimal outcomes. I said the fact that we had history was interesting, but not really relevant to the commercial logic of what we'd built here. Then I said that if she wanted to think of it as revenge, that was her choice. But revenge suggested I cared about hurting them, specifically when really I just cared about winning. I stood up and said the funds needed to be transferred within 48 hours per the agreement terms, and that once the transfer was complete, we could begin the operational transition. I thanked them for dinner and for their cooperation, shook hands with both attorneys in a perfectly professional manner, and left. Driving away from the estate that second time felt different than the first. There was satisfaction, but also a kind of emptiness, a recognition that I'd achieved exactly what I'd worked toward, and it felt smaller than I'd expected. The Prescotts would wake up tomorrow with less money and less power, and I'd wake up with more of both, but fundamentally, we'd all still be trapped in the same systems that had created the conditions for this conflict in the first place. The funds transferred on schedule. The restructuring proceeded according to the formal agreements. Prescott Construction Holdings was reorganized under new ownership and management, with our firm and our partners controlling all major decisions. Maxwell Prescott attended a few board meetings in his ceremonial capacity, but quickly faded from operational relevance. Vanessa worked in her VP role for about 8 months before quietly resigning and taking a position at a different company where her last name didn't carry the weight of failure. The company became modestly profitable under competent management with realistic debt levels. We eventually sold it to a larger construction conglomerate for a significant return. My firm established itself as credible in distressed situations and attracted more capital and bigger opportunities. I became wealthy in the way I'd always planned, through patience and strategic positioning rather than luck or brilliance. But there were costs. I'd become someone who saw every relationship as a potential transaction, every conversation as an opportunity to gather information or establish leverage. I'd spent so many years focused on building capacity to compete with people, I resented that I'd never developed the ability to simply be with people I liked. My social life was minimal, my romantic relationships brief and unsatisfying, because I couldn't let anyone close enough to see the mechanisms behind the presentation. I'd won completely, and it had made me fundamentally alone. Sometimes I'd see news about Vanessa or her father, usually business announcements or society page mentions that suggested they'd maintained some version of their previous status, even if the underlying reality was different, and I'd feel nothing, which was somehow worse than hatred or satisfaction would have been. They'd become irrelevant to me, which meant the thing I'd oriented my entire adult life around achieving had lost its meaning the moment it was accomplished. I'd go to my office and manage investments and build wealth, and everyone saw success, but I knew what I'd traded to get here. I'd sacrificed the version of myself who could be genuinely interested in another person, who could take pleasure in simple things, who could exist without constantly calculating advantage. The revenge had been perfect and complete, and it had hollowed me out in ways that couldn't be repaired. Mr. Harlow had been right about disappearing and coming back when you were ready. But what he hadn't mentioned was that you might disappear so thoroughly that you never quite figure out how to come back as a full person, that the strategic version of yourself might eat the authentic version until nothing was left except the machinery of competition. I'd destroyed the Prescotts' power, taken their money, reduced them to supporting players in a story they'd once controlled, and in doing so, I'd completed my own transformation from someone who wanted genuine connection into someone who only understood how to extract value. The victory was total, and the cost was everything that might have made the victory mean something. Years later, I'd occasionally get calls from journalists writing about successful, distressed investors or asking about specific deals, and I'd give professional interviews that outlined strategic thinking without revealing actual motivations. I'd be described as brilliant or ruthless or visionary, and none of those descriptions would capture the truth that I'd simply been a hurt kid who learned to channel humiliation into competence, and then discovered that competence without purpose was just another form of emptiness. The shares Gabriel Thornton left me had been worth about $200,000 when I inherited them. By the time everything was complete, between the shares themselves, the debt positions we'd accumulated, the equity we'd restructured into, and the returns from eventually selling the company, my personal gain from the Prescott situation was probably close to $15 million. It was generational wealth created from a 4% stake and 10 years of patient positioning. But I'd give back a significant portion of it to be able to have a conversation like the ones I used to have with my old chess club friends, where we'd just talk about ideas or movies or nothing in particular, without me calculating how the interaction might be useful later. I'd trade my beautiful apartment for my childhood bedroom, if it meant recovering the version of myself who could read fantasy novels and actually lose himself in them, instead of analyzing their structural elements and commercial viability. The Prescotts went on with diminished but still comfortable lives. I went on with increased but ultimately isolating success. And somewhere in the gap between those outcomes was the truth that revenge is mostly about making yourself into someone the people who hurt you would have to respect. And by the time you become that person, you don't particularly respect yourself anymore. I still sometimes think about the letter I wrote in high school, how earnest and vulnerable it was, how much faith it showed in the possibility of genuine connection, transcending social barriers. I think about how thoroughly that faith was punished, and how completely I learned the lesson that vulnerability is weakness and trust is liability. And I wonder if there was some other response available, some way to process humiliation that didn't require becoming someone capable of elaborate decade-long manipulation. But that's not the choice I made. I made the choice to win, and I did win, and now I live with what winning cost and what it made me. The Prescott estate is probably still there on the edge of town, occupied by whoever bought it when the family downsized. My old high school probably still exists, full of new students navigating the same social hierarchies that seemed so permanent and are actually so temporary. And I'm here in my office with my wealth and my success and my profound disconnection from anything that feels meaningful, having achieved exactly what I set out to achieve and discovered that achievement was just another kind of loss. If Vanessa Prescott thinks about me at all, it's probably with some combination of resentment and confusion about why I cared so much about something that was, to her, barely memorable. And if she understood that the answer was, I didn't care about the specific cruelty nearly as much as I cared about proving I could overcome the powerlessness it revealed, that might make it worse or better, or just differently painful. The story ends with me successful and empty, them diminished but free from obsession, and everyone having learned lessons that would have been cheaper to learn differently. That's all revenge ever is. A very expensive education about the difference between justice and victory, taught to people who usually can't afford the tuition, but pay it anyway, because the alternative feels like accepting that suffering was meaningless. I won, they lost, and we're all worse for it in ways that balance sheets don't capture. That's the truth that Mr. Harlow didn't mention, that understanding the real rules and playing them perfectly will get you exactly what you thought you wanted, and what you thought you wanted probably wasn't worth what you became to get it. Stories like this happen more often than we think. Subscribe if you want to hear the ones that usually stay unspoken. And if this story made you pause, a like helps the channel grow.